This is part 2 of the Principle of Emptiness series, focusing on the term Principle of Emptiness taken from the Fukushima Ryu, Shinobi no Maki's Scroll of Refining Intention. On your screen, you're going to see a reminder image from the first video to remind you of what we're looking at. We're focusing on the term in red and the term in green. Please watch part 1. If you did not watch part 1, please go watch it, because that is the setup and the introduction. And without further ado, we will drop right into part 2. Alright, so let's get into a basic layout. Okay, so Anatman means not self, as in this is not myself, that is not myself. Let that sink in just for a minute, and we'll go into more detail in a further slide. But it doesn't mean no self, it doesn't mean no soul, it means that is not myself, this is not myself. It is a methodology. And Shunyata, emptiness, is both a truth, but it is also a quality at the same time. The quality of emptiness is the same as why Anatman or how Anatman works. That is, this is not the self is tied directly to the emptiness quality of things. So that is not self, this is not self, that is empty of a self, this is empty of a self. Well, they're like different, they are the same teaching, but they are different aspects of the teaching, different applications, but the truth that is being tapped upon is the same. So in the most basic, Anatman is a method in which you understand that there is nothing that can be identified as the self. Everything that you could possibly believe to be the self is shown to be something that is not the self. Everything that you think is self is shown to be not the self. Let me say that one more time. It's the process of learning, of identifying that everything that you identify as the self can be shown to be not the self. A self cannot be found, right? So when it is translated as no self, that is the result of a search. It's not a starting point, right? So in other words, you could say Anatman means no self because I arrived at the concept of no self after searching for self, and everything I found was repeatedly found to be not self, not self, not self. But again, it's not so much a truth, it's a methodology. Emptiness, that is the nature or quality of a thing, objects, thoughts, mind, etc. And that nature or quality, and again, this is a simple fundamental understanding, is that the absence of any inherent or permanent state, form. So anything, when examined, is found to have no inherent nature, no permanent nature, no inherent form, no permanent form. Nothing has an inherent form. There is no inherent nature. All identifiable qualities are not the self, and thus only a quality of emptiness remains. So everything has no quality. The only real, ironically, the only quality that something can said to have is the absence of quality, or the emptiness quality. The thing is empty of an inherent quality. So the best way to really focus on that introduction to a correct understanding of Anatman is to go straight to the sutra in which it is introduced. So I've put the Sanskrit title and the Pali title on the screen. I highly advise that you just Google that and you read the sutra, and it will become very clear what Anatman really is. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to paraphrase it and go through a paraphrased version of it. And so Buddha says, monks, and they say, yes, venerable sir. And then the sutra really starts. He says, form is not self, for if form were self, it would not lead to affliction. You would be able to compel form by saying things like, my form be like this, may my form be like that. But because form is not self, it leads to afflictions. Because form is not self, you cannot compel form, may my form be like this, may my form be like that. And then he goes through the rest of the skandha, feeling, perception, and consciousness, etc., etc. Goes through all 5 of them. And then he says, so what do you think, monks? Is form permanent or is it impermanent? And they answer, it's impermanent, sir. And then he says, if it is impermanent, is it suffering or happiness? And they say, oh, it's suffering, sir. And he says, if it is impermanent and it is suffering and perishable, is it fit to be regarded as, this is mine, I am this is myself? And the monks respond, no, sir. And then this is, of course, applied to all of the five skandha. And then essentially Buddha says, so you should truly see all kinds of form, from past, future, present, internal or external, solid or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all form, with the right understanding of, this is not mine, I am not this is not myself. And then that applies to all the skandha. And then it ends with, seeing this, a learned noble disciple grows disillusioned with form, feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness. Being disillusioned, desire fades away. When desire fades away, they are free. When they are freed, they know they are freed. And they understand rebirth is ended, the spiritual journey is complete, what had to be done is done, there is nothing further for this place. So, this is one of the very first sutras spoken by Buddha to the first five disciples. The first five disciples that he sort of ordains are those five mendicants that become his first students. And so this is given to them, and this is the first actual introduction of Anatman. And so from this, we can clearly see that it's referencing a process, it's referencing a method. It's not an ontological truth that negates the mind stream, right? So let's take a minute to look at some of the misunderstandings people have about it, which this sutra clears away. So hopefully some of you, having just sort of like heard me say this, read it on the screen, maybe you pause it and Googled it, you're like, oh wow, so I see what Anatman actually means. But let's talk about some of the misunderstandings and clear those up. So what I would like to do now is tackle one of the biggest misunderstandings of Anatman in the West. And that is that there's been a massive push from atheist scholars to try and make Anatman mean no soul. And that's just wrong, and it completely misses the point. You guys just looked at the sutra that introduces Anatman. Nowhere in there does it say no soul. It just says that is not self, that is not self. So again, the no soul thing is a stretch, right? The Anatman is actually a procedure for understanding anything that you can identify is not the self, right? It's not a direct negation of a self. It's rather you saying, I cannot find anything that is the self. Now, the idea of thus there is no self, yes, there is no self is arrived at, but it is arrived at because you couldn't find anything that was the self. Everything that you looked at was not the self. That's not the same as no soul. It very clearly is not the same as no soul, because no self would mean that whatever your mind stream is empty in nature. You just can't identify it, versus the postulation of a soul or a no soul. Like, okay, so enumerated. Number one, Anatman doesn't negate the nature. So first off, very, very bluntly, I'll cut to the chase. Anatman doesn't negate the nature of mind or the mind stream. All right. So for those of you that know a little bit about advanced Buddhism, you have the relative truth and the absolute truth. You have samsara and nirvana. So Anatman only applies to negating the relative self or negating the samsaric self. Okay. So it doesn't negate the nature of mind. And it doesn't negate the continuation of a mind stream. It just says that if you look for it, you can't find any sort of you can't find a core, you can't find a permanent quality. So you learn not to mistake other phenomenon for the self. Again, it's a procedure to teach you to disconnect and not attach to phenomenon as self. is not a negation of the mind's nature. It's not a negation of the mind stream. The second point enumerated is that soul is a very, very Western idea, and what the heck does it even mean? I'm about to show you that it doesn't even apply to the conversation. So first and foremost, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I don't really know what a non-Buddhist means when they say soul. I just don't. When I ask people who believe in a soul or preach about a soul, I can't really seem to get any kind of coherent answer, like a unified answer about what the soul is what it supposedly is. So to me, as a Buddhist, lifelong Buddhist, I'm not really sure what you guys mean when you say soul, but what it appears to be, at least to me, is that it's a kind of an amorphous placeholder for a jumbled collection of ideas concerning the alleged eternal qualities or eternal aspects of someone's identity. So, as best as I can tell, when people say soul, they're referring to a self-existing eternal identity comprised of unique qualities that are unique and specific just to that single identity and that persist unchanging throughout all time. In that case, then what you guys are calling soul would be similar to the Brahma Atman concept. And that is that your mind is this permanently existing substance that has a unique shape and unique qualities that never change. And it's really unique to just that. Each one of these Atmans has its own unique set of qualities that never change. So I think that when people say soul, they're referring to something similar to the Brahma Atman concept. But so, to be blunt, yes, Buddhism does negate that idea. In fact, in so many ways, the Anatman teaching serves specifically to negate the Brahma Atman idea. Buddha taught specifically that there is no eternal substances. No such eternal substance exists, right? All things that take shape change shape. There is no eternal substance existing anywhere in the world. So Anatman does negate the Brahma Atman concept. But again, not really through an ontological truth such as there's no soul, but rather by a systematic deconstruction. In other words, if the Brahma Atman concept was true, you would have to be able to show what is the self. But the problem is every time you investigate anything that is allegedly the self, it always turns out to be not the self. Right? Each of the qualities of the soul are ultimately found to be something other than the soul. So any quality that you attribute to the self or the soul is found to not actually be the self, but something conceptually tied to the self. So then, as you continue to realize that every single attempt to identify the self just turns into realizing that the thing that you identified is something else, and that it is not the self. As you continue to do that, then you eventually enter into the phase of emptiness, or into Shunyata. That is, you find that the thing you're looking at, it appears, the thing that you're looking for, right, it appears, and it functions. Yet, upon inspection, upon dissection, it is found to not be findable. Let that sink in just for a minute. So this inability to ever lock in on an intrinsic quality is Anatman and emptiness. So in a way, you can see that Anatman is the procedure and emptiness is the principle. Or you can say emptiness is the conclusion. So when you say, like in the Fukushima scroll, the principle of emptiness, it is the principle that things appear and those appearances do function. But when you actually dissect and analyze, you end up with no intrinsic core. Now there is a very, very proliferate author, very well loved and respected Buddhist scholar named Nagarjuna, and he had a huge influence on Northern Indian Buddhism and Chinese and Japanese Buddhism, and he was a master of explaining emptiness. Esoteric schools like Tibetan Buddhism and Shingon and Tendai and even Chan and Zen schools use a lot of his writings. So when you're looking at samurai scrolls, you know that Buddhist samurai authors or authors of samurai scrolls who would be influenced by Buddhist thought would be influenced by Tendai, Shingon, Zen, and those schools are influenced by Nagarjuna. Therefore, you can look at Nagarjuna's explanations because they would trickle down into Zen and Chan and Shingon and Tendai. So what I'm saying is if you want to look into Nagarjuna to understand samurai stuff more, it's a good idea because Nagarjuna's teachings absolutely influenced the teachings that would have influenced the samurai. So another simple way of understanding, but useful, since the whole point of this video is to try to get you a useful understanding of what is being referred to. So emptiness is the lack of a permanent and an intrinsic core. Emptiness is the lack of permanent and intrinsic qualities. So emptiness is the truth that all things lack permanent and intrinsic qualities and core. Anatman is the method for examining and understanding things so as to arrive at the understanding of the emptiness. So Anatman is not applied just to the self of the practitioner, but Anatman can also be, and is supposed to be applied to the self of anything, right? So for example, the wheel of a car is not the self of the car, right? So again, means Anatman isn't saying no soul. Anatman is saying this is not the intrinsic core. This is not an intrinsic quality. This is not the self. It applies to your own stream of consciousness and psychological constituents, but it also applies to physical objects too. It's just the Anatman is the method and emptiness is the conclusion. All right, so let's do a little bit more myth busting. Some people have said, and I've heard some of you guys say this, and I've heard other YouTubers post it, and people write it, and the samurai community is really bad at this one, so I'm going to call it out. A lot of you guys say that Anatman means that I oblivion at death, right? And that the next life is a completely different person. This is absolutely not accurate. No. Just straight up. No. Wrong. Inaccurate. There is a continuum. There is a mind stream. Anatman does not negate that. Remember, I said earlier, Anatman doesn't negate the nature of mind or Buddha nature. Anatman does not apply to the nature of mind or the Buddha nature. When people say there is no mind, they don't mean that there is not the nature of mind. There is no mind means there is no relative mind. There is no samsaric mind. All of the samsaric mental functions are Anatman, but the nature is not addressed by the term Anatman. Okay? The person, so when you say I'm a completely different person in the next life, what you're talking about is the person you are now isn't a solid single object. The person that you are now is a temporary collection of traits and qualities. And that will absolutely change in your next life. But that doesn't mean that the next person is a completely different mind or a completely different mind stream from you now. The next life is a continuation of the mind stream. It's a continuation of the processes taking place right now. And to harp on this point some more, remember, Buddhism teaches the middle path. This is the way between extremes. And the two fundamental extremes are eternalism and annihilationism. Buddha rejects both. So eternalism is like that Brahma Atman idea. Eternalism is the idea that you're a self-generated eternal being with unchanging qualities. like for example, that your soul, to use y'all's word soul, has eternal traits, and even has, and in some, like the Brahma Atman, in some Hindu sort of ideas, they even have this idea that the soul has a clan, an eternal clan that it's part of, and that your soul owes loyalty to the other clan members of this soul clan, etc., right? Because this is an eternal quality of the light of your being. Okay, but Buddhism rejects all of that. Buddhism says you have no eternal identity, you have no eternal traits, you have no eternal um, obligations to any sort of clan or anything like that, etc. All of that, no, none of that. So basically, any viewpoint that says something is eternally locked in like this, Buddha says no, that's eternalism, and that extreme is rejected. The other extreme, so the opposite end of the extreme of the spectrum, so to speak, is annihilationism, and that is the idea that like nothing matters, nothing, cause and effect, just nothing. No, there's not really cause and effect. There's no continuation. When you die, you completely cease to exist. Oblivion. Anything that comes after you die is completely disconnected and unrelated to you right now that dies and goes into oblivion, etc., etc., etc. Cause and effect has no purpose, no consequences, because everything is oblivion, etc., etc. That is annihilationism. Buddha also expressly rejects that idea as well. So, eternalism is rejected by Buddhism, annihilationism is rejected by Buddhism. So therefore, by definition, this misconception, this idea that Anatman means that you cease at death and that the next person is completely unrelated to you, that the next person is a completely different being, that idea therefore is by definition completely rejected by Buddha, because that's actually the extreme of annihilationism. Furthermore, Nagarjuna, who I mentioned earlier, in his Root Verses of the Middle Way, I believe it's the 10th chapter specifically, he addresses that wrong view, and he soundly shuts it down as well. So if you want to read Root Verses of the Middle Way, I believe it's chapter 10, the 10th section, go there, and he specifically addresses the idea that this life and the next life are completely disconnected, and how that is a wrong view. So he addresses that as well. So not only is it soundly rejected by Buddha in the Vinaya canon, but also later on Nagarjuna also explains why it doesn't work as well. And Nagarjuna doesn't make anything up. This is another thing I have to say. Nothing that Nagarjuna says is made up by Nagarjuna. Everything he says is based on the sutra. It comes from the sutra. So it's not like he's making new stuff up. He's making up new and innovative ways of explaining it, but it's all found in the sutra. And again, like I said, because Nagarjuna is held in great respect by esoteric schools and most of the Chinese and Japanese schools, his works and explanations would be relevant to samurai writings that reference the principle of emptiness. So again, as such, I highly advise those who are watching and listening this video to understand that the idea that no self means annihilation at death, please understand that that is inaccurate and that is wrong. And that is not at all what Buddhism teaches, and that a Buddhist samurai author writing scrolls and manuals would absolutely not be believing or thinking about annihilationism in their text about emptiness. Before we finish part 2, let me say some things that I almost forgot to say, because to me it was very evident, but I need to make sure that it's said, because I don't know who's viewing this video, so I have to make sure that I address this. And that is that the author of the Fukushima Ryu no Maki, the Scroll of Refining Intention, Nojiri Jiroemon, he would have undoubtedly been influenced by specific documents and teachings of Shingon, Zen, and Pure Land, etc., etc., aka the schools and the ideas that were floating around Japan at that time. So, therefore, to go to have a better understanding of the emptiness and shunyata as explained in Japan, you would need to study specifically what's being explained in those teachings. But to go in depth on each one of those is way beyond the scope of this video. But I do need to say that to make sure the viewer understands that what we're presenting here is a very basic introductory understanding, and that if you want to actually understand it more, you would need to study it more. And if you wanted to be specific about what would the author of the text, then you would need to hone in specifically on schools like Shingon and the different Zen traditions, etc., etc. Okay, that's kind of obvious to some of you, but I have to make sure I say it just to be sure. Now, secondly, furthermore, I need to remind the viewers that there is an extensive amount of teachings on Anatman and Shunyata in Buddhism in general, and we can't even begin to go into to scratch the surface of the depth of the teachings. But if you, the viewer, are interested in going a little deeper than what we're talking about in the video, I would suggest that you check out the Heart Sutra. It's a very good place to start. It's quoted in a lot of samurai writings, and it has the famous line, Iha Shariputra Rupam Shunya Shunyata Iha Rupam. Alas, Sariputra, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Now, that is actually an incredibly deep line that seems basic, but actually has a very esoteric explanation. In fact, actually, the entire Heart Sutra reads fairly easily, but has basic to advanced to deep esoteric meanings. But all of that is beyond the scope of this video. However, I would still encourage you to check out the Heart Sutra, because Nojiri Jiroemon, the author of the text we're looking at, would have absolutely had knowledge of and would have studied the Heart Sutra. So, as did many samurai, many Buddhist samurai read the Heart Sutra. So, if you want to get into their minds more, you would need to study the Heart Sutra.